mean, when I approach it apologetically, I have a very specific way of going about it. I critique the worldview as a whole. I look at, I look at the knowledge, the epistemology, I look at the metaphysical assumptions, and I look at the ethical assumptions of their paradigm. And across the board, that seems to be, in my view, the most effective way to really critique every single atheist view, because you find that they all have the same starting ground. They all have the same presuppositions. They're all going to start on the assumptions of naturalism, the assumptions of subjectivism, the assumptions of naive empiricism, on and on and on and on. And you'll find these
internally contradictory, but yeah,
exactly. That's what I want to do is always point out the internal contradictions, because they act like they have the claim on logic. They act like facts and logic are in their side. But when you actually start talking about what logic is, or the ontological metaphysical status of what logic is, silence. Yeah. They're in another dimension. What are you talking about?
Same gesture, yes. Well, yes. Unfortunately, they often don't even seem to know what the word logic refers to. It has a very specific meaning. It has a very specific technical meaning. It's not just some feel good, let me feel smart about myself word that you throw out just to bamboozle your opponent. But yeah, I mean, you can go deep. I think a lot of times when Christian apologists kind of try to address the epistemological basis of their opponent's argument, they reach deep for an answer when there's a much more immediate answer close at hand.
Yes,
they'll say, if an atheist says, everything we know can be proven by science, it's not necessary to reach over here and say, well, how can you know anything? It's just point out the obvious fact that what they just said is self-invalidating.
Yes, exactly. That phrase,
yeah,
that phrase itself is not something that can be empirically, scientifically validated. And you point that out a lot, and most of the time it gets ignored, and the response is, you're playing word games.
Yeah.
And this is very ironic, because this is what they will often accuse the theist of doing, of playing word games. And then they'll turn around and try to go back to using logic as the debate or the discussion progresses. And you just have to keep calling them back to the fact that, but look, you're using something that in your perspective doesn't make any sense at all. It doesn't make any sense how on a metaphysical naturalism assumption, there could be something like an invariant law, a rule, a maxim, a principle operant in the world, and somehow operant in our minds and in our daily living, and how we build bridges based on these logical mathematical principles, and they're not material. That doesn't make sense in a world of flux matter that's always constantly in movement and changing. And once you start going down that route, I've never ever seen an atheist have any even slightly sensible response to these kinds of questions.
Yeah, well, that kind of goes into what I wanted to talk about is atheist propaganda. It is, as I said in my messages to you, it's very boilerplate. It's you'll encounter the same phrases over and over and over, but it's not just the expressions they use themselves. There are other tactics that are kind of alarmingly just standardized, for one. And one of the things we kind of opposite to what you just said are these kind of escape hatches they have. These kind of escape hatches that they pull to eject themselves from maybe an uncomfortable spot in the discussion.
Mm-hmm.
And if you've ever noticed, I mean, we've all heard, I'm sure you've heard dozens and dozens of times, it's like, Invisible Sky Fairy and Bronze Age goat herders and all that stuff. But there are also like tactics, I guess you would be more knowledgeable about this, but they're almost like Alinsky tactics, where you state your position to them and they phrase it back to you in an altered form. They lie about what you just said, and it's always the same. They always misrepresent your position in the same way.
That's a good point. Yeah, and that's, I think, a sign of the inner conflict that's going on in the atheist mind.
Yeah,
because really what's going on in atheism is a contradiction and a fundamental at root clash within themselves over, on the one hand, wanting to have a world that's ordered, that's logical, that's rational, that manifests these scientific laws and principles in nature, these natural laws, and at the same time in order to go against anything that's quote immaterial or that can't quote be seen or whatever, they have to constantly also set up a position of total irrationality. So for example, a lot of times in those kinds of debates, I'll talk about your ultimate metaphysical assumption of the absolute, or a lot of times they'll talk about pantheism. They'll say, Richard Dawkins, so I'm a pantheist. I can support pantheism, but I can't support anything like a deity. I can support aliens, but I can't support pantheism. So they'll have this assumption that there's some kind of absolute universal principle that does in some way apply. Sometimes it's quote logic, sometimes it's math, sometimes it's scientific laws, sometimes it's whatever. And so again, those are contrary to the principles of everything being pure chaos, pure evolutionary flux, pure change. And so they don't even realize that they're caught in a dialectic of, on the one hand, the very thing that they need in order to make their arguments logical is the very ground that they're standing on is theism. Because in my view, God is the only thing that makes sense of things like logic, ethics, mathematics. And when you bundle all of those things together, all of them, it makes perfect sense in a theistic worldview. It does not make any sense in a worldview of pure chaos and nothingness and just
not even talking about physical laws, which are a whole other thing. But yeah, the fudge they would typically do there is to claim that the laws of logic are descriptive rather than prescriptive, which doesn't really solve their problem at all, because the whole point about being descriptive is that it describes something outside of itself. So that doesn't really solve their problem at all.
Exactly. That's a good point. And if you noticed in the debate, if you happen to see the debate I did with JF and other atheists that I've interacted with, they will oftentimes deny free will. Now, not all of them do, but
I was going to go there. Yeah.
Many of them do. And what this amounts to is what's sometimes called the naturalist fallacy or the determinist fallacy. And it's always important to hammer this home, because what we see in this is an illustration of again, a fundamental contradiction, to where they want credit for discovering the truths that they've come to. They want credit for their will and their might engaged in the combat of reason and debate.
And the courageousness of throwing the shackles, of casting off the shackles of religious superstition to gaze at the world.
I always think of Jesse. I always think of Jesse Ventura going, I don't need a God to be my crutch, right? Now, at the same time, these people, they'll turn around and say, 99% of the time, they'll say, there's no free will. We're not, so you didn't come to your positions. You didn't discover these. You don't deserve any courage or credit or moral opprobrium, right? Or moral acclaim because you were courageous. You're just like a weed growing, dude. You're just like a science project of baking soda and vinegar bubbling over. That's all you are. Does
the baking soda bubble over courageously? Does it rationally? No, it just bubbles over. Yeah. I mean that's obvious to me. Is that materialist determinism cannibalizes all the virtues that atheists would love to apply to themselves. So I think. A lot of their anger, and I would apply this in different situations too. A lot of their anger at Christians, at theists in general, stems from a kind of projection of their own frustrations with their own worldview. It's kind of like, this is a potentially volatile example, but like when pro-choicers accost a pro-lifer and you just want to control women's bodies. Well, they're projecting their frustration at their own view that they are basically prisoners of their own biology. It's a very dreadful view. So I think they kind of externalize that unhappiness onto their ideological opponent. I think that's kind of what's going on with atheists and Christians, is that they have this frustration. They want to be the courageous actor. They want to be brave and rational and they want to feel superior to their benighted whatever.
I was about to bust my fedora out, but I don't. It's in my.
Oh, you're gonna have a character.
Yeah, I have a fedora, but I'll wear it as a joke if I'm going to be the atheist guy. But yeah, that's a great insight. In fact, to the psychology of the committed atheist is internal struggle and the contradiction that I think you're right manifests itself in that anger at everybody else. And actually, I've seen this in a lot of people. It's not just something that you see in the atheists, like you said. You see this in the radical anti-life crowd. You see this in the people who act out and do these kinds of bizarre, like feminist demonstrations. They do the same kind of weird stuff, and they are really projecting their own inner just hatred outside. And I think that this is, again, that's a manifestation of the inner dialectical conflict between loving yourself to the point of idolatry and thinking you are your own God, and at the same time hating yourself and despising yourself. So there's these two things at war in the mind of the unbeliever.
Yeah. And well, I mean, no one can consistently believe themselves to not have free will. I mean, no one can really pull off that high wire act. I mean,
that's a great point, because a lot of times they'll want, if they do go into an argument about this, they'll try to keep it in the realm of theory, and they won't ever bring it back into the realm of the here and now. Because when you bring it back into the realm of here and now, you point out that you don't actually live according to your atheist materialist presuppositions. Like, why do you go to a funeral? Right? I mean, there's absolutely no reason to go to, right? Why do you talk about loving your girlfriend? That's not really true, right? Oh, it's just a chemical reaction, whatever. But yeah, so in their daily life, they're mad if somebody doesn't give them their change back. They expect the proper change. No, there's no reason to give you proper change, bro. Like, there's no logical force binding me to do that. The non-aggression principle. Why should I follow the non-aggression principle in a world that's pure jungle?
I found that about a lot of libertarians. They think like the nap is just this magic wand they can wave over everything that's going to solve every sort of potential social conflict.
Yeah, that's a very naive and ahistorical view.
Voluntarism is just gonna make everything work together.
Right, and many of them are atheists. So why is there such a thing as voluntarism? Why is there such a thing as free will? I mean, that presupposes the idea of a subject, a psyche, a mind with volition, with responsibility, with creativity, with will.
Yeah, and what possible gain is there to factoring it out entirely? What does it matter, even if it's true? What is the virtue in believing what is true?
Yeah, exactly. You can always kind of stack these questions on even further and say, but again, in this materialist, flux universe, none of that even matters. You're just basically a drop in an infinity of nothingness, right? So your life is a little blip on the radar screen in the span of eternity, past and eternity, future. It means nothing.
Well, so that's why I think the best strategy is always to illustrate how what they say is internally contradictory.
Yes.
By holding their beliefs to their own standards before examining those standards themselves. That's why I always say go for the immediate response before you get into those kind of deep epistemological questions. So
Yeah, I agree. Most of the time, the easiest way to do this is to focus on the moral or the ethical questions, because in that worldview, there's no basis at all for objective moral or ethical standards. Now, they'll talk a lot about it. That, well, the most common answer I hear is that eventually we'll figure out a scientific way to have moral standards. Now, science, which is a good thing, right? Science is a tool for understanding the natural world, for doing engineering and all kinds of things. Nothing wrong with that. It makes perfect sense in a world regulated by providence and God's divine principles operant in the world. But science doesn't make sense in terms of its regularity on a worldview which is, again, chaotic, random, just one damn thing after another, as many atheists have said. So the very thing that we are turning to as a kind of new religious approach, and I totally believe scientism is the religion of our day, it becomes obviously a new dogma, and you will hear them talk about it in the exact same way that a person who has a religious commitment views their perspective. And I believe this is because humans are fundamentally religious beings. So you'll hear them say, well, one day we'll figure it out, right? So they have the eschatological hope that one day there'll be a moral calculus, according to Jeremy Bentham and the other utilitarians. Will come up with a moral calculus with a giant supercomputer that will figure out how one thing is right and one thing is wrong, right? Total gobbledygook. right?
Which
That's
is
called faith.
a hedonic calculus, essentially. Just
Mhm.
measuring things by the avoidance of pain, which is a horrible worldview. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's amazing how many people will think that that's like a solid answer to the question of how, in the atheistic materialistic perspective, we can have, standards and objective notions of right and wrong. It's, well, we'll do the moral calculus. We'll have utilitarianism. Don't you know that's been tried? Don't you know that leads to obviously absurd conclusions? I mean, for example, you have no way to know in a utilitarian perspective whether you should choose the pleasure principle of one in a qualitative sense, like one guy who gets a whole lot of pleasure out of one thing, as opposed to like a million people that get a little bit of pleasure out of something.
Yeah.
Right? You don't have there's no way to know, like, oh, you're supposed to do this one, right?
Yeah.
And I'll give you the floor after this, but one thing I always point out is that let's say there's one guy who we can come up with a moral calculus that says that this guy, even though he's innocent, let's say the whole village, the whole town is worried about a serial killer on the loose. Okay. Now we could let him go, but people are going to be afraid and upset and terrified. It might cause a lot of social disturbance, right? Businesses won't get they won't sell their wares. They won't be able to, do business because people are terrified of the serial killer at night, right? So
you nab an innocent guy to create the illusion.
We nab an innocent guy and we put him to death publicly in the public square, and it quells everybody's fear, even though he wasn't the right guy. Now, so in the moral calculus, how do we know whether the quantitative assurance and rest and ease of the population is or isn't better than the execution of the innocent guy?
Yeah, well, there are all in this calculus. There are all sorts of problems with finding the proverbial area under the curve. I mean, Christopher Missing the Mark, who's a guy I do hangouts with. He was like, okay, well, is it better for a million creatures to flourish for 2 months, or for 5 creatures to flourish for 2 million years? I mean,
that's a great variation. Yeah.
I mean, it's never mind that the equation of creaturely flourishing with morality is simply by dint of assertion, By the way, you probably don't keep up with this. Did you see when Sam Harris posted his freshman intro to philosophy 101 attempt at getting an ought from an is, and he posted it on his Facebook page? He was getting savaged by his own followers in the comments to his own Facebook page. So he's getting pushback, and you'll see this a lot, I think, with a lot of the atheist superstars, is that they're getting more and more pushback as time goes on. I think what was it? Were you involved with that? No, it was some guy. What's the name? Mouthy Buddha. Yeah, he posted a picture where he said it used to be the case where if he posted something anti-religious, it was just gravy and people loved it. Now he says, now I'm starting to get more and more pushback. Mm-hmm. He's just talking about in recent months. So this is a very recent development. And his idea, and I don't really want to speculate on that, is that Jordan Peterson is poaching a lot of Sam Harris's followers.
I did see some of this. Yeah, I didn't see the thing about his followers savaging his argument.
No, this was something else. This was
okay, but I did see the claim about Jordan Peterson kind of grabbing some of the Sam Harris crowd, and ultimately I think that's a good thing. I mean, I have some.
Jordan Peterson is not perfect by any stretch of the imagination.
I mean, yeah, I think I have some, but actually, believe it or not, I've seen him tweet out transcendental arguments. In fact, he tweeted a thing several years ago that was quite literally an argument I made in a paper about Platonism and the status of numbers. Not 100% positive if you read it or not, but we do have mutual contacts that he does a lot of shows with. So again, I'm not saying for sure that he read the paper, but I think it's entirely plausible that he read it, and he does seem to kind of at times hint at using a transcendental argument, which is what I tend to use in my apologetic approach. I think it's the most solid apologetic methodology out there. And to be a little more specific on that point, I do think you can use the cosmological or the teleological or the ontological, but I think they have to be kind of formatted in a transcendental way to make them a little more powerful than they are traditionally, especially in something like Thomism. So I have a pretty severe criticism of Aquinas and Thomism, but that's not to say that you can't still do a transcendental form of each one of those arguments. But anyway, that's a side issue. I think the skeptic community has been on the decline. I think you're right. This is something that's been especially evident in the last few months. And I think this is going to continue. I've been saying for a long time that these internet atheists would not be able to get away, and the pop atheists, the big guys, would not be able to keep getting away with bad arguments in the age of the internet. It's not going to work because people are going to keep chipping away at this. And eventually people are going to start seeing that's a bad argument, dude. Like literally Dawkins and these guys, I've got Dawkins books here. They just rehash like 1700s era philosophe French Revolution atheist arguments. It's like they don't even think about the fact that, hey, maybe I should actually educate myself on more like maybe theists have responded in the last 300 years to these bad arguments from 1700.
Well, I mean, that's their entire presupposition that they are the rational elite.
Yeah, exactly.
And I mean, no, they remember like back when Sarah Palin was a big thing, and everyone always used the same word. They called her incurious, and they always say, "Oh, well, Sarah Palin's so incurious." That is like the exact word to define Richard Dawkins and his acolytes. It's like one of them will jump out at you. Well, if God made the world, then who made God? It's like, do you not think that maybe somebody might have had an answer to this? It's not even a big concern of mine that you don't know what people have said, because that's a problem that could be remedied. But when you care so little even to find out. And the other thing, and this is going back to like atheist propaganda, you will notice the atheists will always demand of you, where is your evidence for God? And they said your, like it's to trivialize or belittle it. So you're supposed to give your little show and tell presentation. Here's my evidence for God. I'm humbly submitting it. They never say, hey, what are some good resources I could use to educate myself? Would you mind pointing me in a direction? No, it is incumbent upon you to present your evidence on a little silver platter so they could swat it away like a gay French king or something, Like, no, this evidence displeases me. This is not evidence.
Bring me my little John goblet full of wine. Yeah.
Bring it to them a little good.
Bring my wine, wench. I don't find, generally speaking, a lot of actual philosophical knowledge on the part of the atheist.
No.
Even the ones that I've encountered in my academic career, which most of the professors I had would be atheists. There was a few theists, but most of them were pretty hardcore committed atheists and naturalists and materialists. And I would always, oftentimes have, pretty lengthy interactions with all the professors. I even had public debate with my philosophy of science professor, who was a hardcore naturalist, my sophomore year. So public debate. So what I tended to start noticing is that even amongst these academic elite, of the atheist world, they don't even know oftentimes kind of basic philosophy.
Yes.
In other words, they've never had a class in logic. They don't know about informal fallacies. They couldn't tell you what no true Scotsman fallacy is. They couldn't tell you what the bandwagon fallacy is, but they will pontificate about all kinds of things, especially if they're a hardcore Darwinist. So maybe they've had like biology, right? Maybe this guy studied a lot of biology, and maybe he knows a lot about life science to a degree in a very limited scope. But when you start talking about logic or principles of logic operant in the world or in nature, or meta logic, which I talk about a lot, what you get is like glaze and then and then how you're a bad person, right? So you're an arrogant whatever for talking about something that I don't know about, right? And that's because, for a lot of reasons, but U.S. education and then education in the West for a long time, based on the Prussian model, is very compartmentalized. And you can literally get your PhD in something and never have had a logic class.